when Jake Morrison, 32 years old, an unemployed mechanic for 9 months with only $60 in his pocket and an eviction notice taped to his apartment door, saw a red Ferrari broken down on the side of the Pacific Coast Highway with smoke pouring from the hood. He didn't think about asking for money or charging for help. He thought of something more desperate and bold. He approached the elegant woman, staring at the engine with frustration, and said those words that would change both their lives forever. He didn't know that woman was Victoria Sterling, 30 years old, CEO of one of the largest automotive empires in America, heir to a $700 million fortune, and the loneliest person who existed in that moment, despite being surrounded by people who wanted something from her. And when the next day Jake showed up at the address she gave him, he discovered a truth that would leave him speechless. Because sometimes fate puts you exactly where you need to be, even when everything seems lost. And sometimes the richest people are the ones hungriest for something money can't buy: honesty. If you're ready for this story, right where you're watching this video from. The Pacific Coast Highway gleamed under the July sun like a ribbon of liquid asphalt. It was noon, and the heat made the air shimmer, creating mirages on the horizon. Traffic flowed fast. Luxury SUVs and German sedans racing toward beachfront mansions in Malibu, carrying people who had everything except time to stop. Jake Morrison walked along the shoulder with a backpack on his shoulders, his face covered in sweat, jeans stained with grease he'd stopped bothering to wash. He'd just left another auto shop where he'd asked for work and received another no. Too qualified for menial jobs, not connected enough for the real ones. 9 months since the shop where he'd worked for 12 years had closed, the owner fleeing to Mexico, leaving debts and workers without paychecks. 9 months of savings melting away, of back rent piling up, of calls from collection agencies threatening foreclosure. He was 32 but felt ancient, tall, with broad shoulders from a lifetime lifting engines, large calloused hands, brown hair always disheveled. He wore a faded white t-shirt and work boots, begging for mercy. In his backpack were just a sandwich he couldn't afford to buy and the resume nobody wanted to see. He was thinking about returning to his hometown in Nebraska, asking for shelter from his retired parents, who barely made it to the end of the month themselves, when he saw it. A Ferrari 488 Spider in red stopped on the shoulder with the hood open and steam rising like a wounded dragon. It was the kind of car Jake only saw in magazines, the kind that cost more than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes, and next to the car was her. Victoria Sterling was talking on the phone with an exasperated tone, gesticulating with her free hand while holding the cell with the other. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost as much as a compact car, vertiginous heels that seemed to defy the laws of physics, blonde hair pulled into a perfect bun. Chanel sunglasses hid her eyes, but irritation was evident in every line of her body. Jake hesitated. Every instinct told him to pass by, not to meddle in the problems of the rich who had money to call the most luxurious tow service in California. But then he thought about the water bill, the landlord threatening eviction, his mechanic's tools that were the only valuable thing he owned and would soon have to sell. He approached. Victoria saw him coming and instinctively stepped back, her hand gripping the phone tighter. Jake stopped at a respectful distance, noting her tension. He said he was a mechanic, that he could take a look if she wanted. His voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but firm. Victoria looked at him from behind the dark glasses, evaluating. She saw a man who seemed to have seen better days, but whose eyes were direct, and without that slimy hunger she saw in all the men who approached her Ferrari. There was something desperate but honest about him. She lowered the phone and told him to go ahead. Jake dropped his backpack and approached the smoking engine. He knew what was wrong before he even looked. The noise he'd heard when she passed, the type of smoke, the smell in the air. Broken water pump, collapsed cooling system. For a Ferrari, it was a serious but solvable problem with the right tools. He explained the problem with technical terms that surprised her. He wasn't trying to impress her or speak beyond his capabilities. He knew these engines like he knew his own heartbeat. Victoria listened, then asked how much he'd charge to fix it. Jake looked at the empty road, the merciless sun beating down, this woman who probably spent on one lunch what he earned in a week when he had work. And then he said those words that would change everything. He didn't want money, he wanted a job. Any job at her companies, at her shops, at her dealerships. He was an excellent mechanic, had 12 years of experience, could fix anything with an engine. All he needed was a chance. The silence that followed was as thick as the July air. Victoria studied him, this desperate man who smelled of honesty and motor oil, who wasn't asking her for money but opportunity. Then she did something that surprised them both. She said yes. She told him to fix the car, and if he succeeded, the next day he'd show up at Sterling Automotive Group headquarters in Los Angeles. She gave him a business card with the address. Then she called someone on the phone and ordered them to bring whatever the mechanic needed. 20 minutes later, a van arrived with tools and parts. Jake worked under the scorching sun, hands remembering movements he hadn't made in months, body finding its natural rhythm. Victoria watched him in silence, noting the confidence with which he moved, the care with which he treated the engine, the sweat streaking his face but not slowing him down. 2 hours later, the Ferrari purred perfectly. Jake closed the hood with the satisfaction of a job well done. Victoria got in the driver's seat, started the engine, listened. Perfect. She looked at him through the window and told him not to forget tomorrow. Then she drove off in a cloud of red dust, leaving Jake alone on the shoulder with the business card in his hand and something he hadn't felt in 9 months: hope. Jake arrived home as the sun set over Los Angeles, turning the buildings into golden silhouettes. His apartment was a studio on the 5th floor, with no elevator in a building that had seen better days. Peeling walls, second-hand furniture, a window overlooking a courtyard where kids played between dumpsters. But it was home, at least until the landlord threw him out. That evening, Jake cleaned the only decent shirt he had, ironed his least-worn pants, polished his shoes with a rag. He looked at the business card at least 100 times. Sterling Automotive Group, Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, an address in downtown L.A., the district of gleaming skyscrapers where the wealthy made billion-dollar deals. Jake knew nothing about Victoria beyond what he'd seen on the highway. He didn't know she'd grown up in a mansion in Beverly Hills, only daughter of Robert Sterling, an automotive magnate who'd built an empire starting from a small dealership in the 70s. He didn't know she'd studied business at Stanford, graduating summa cum laude, then did an MBA at Harvard, spoke 4 languages, could negotiate million-dollar contracts before breakfast. He didn't know Victoria had become CEO at just 28 when her father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her alone to lead a company with 4,000 employees and impossible expectations. He didn't know she'd spent the last 2 years fighting board members who didn't take her seriously, business partners who underestimated her, and an extended family waiting for her to fail so they could take what they considered rightfully theirs. He didn't know Victoria was 30 and had no real friends, only acquaintances who invited her to parties where everyone wanted something from her. That she'd had 3 relationships in the last 2 years, all with men who said they loved her but loved her money and connections more. That she woke every morning at 5 to go to the gym, not because she loved fitness, but because it was the only time she could stop thinking. And Victoria knew nothing about Jake beyond what she'd seen on the highway, a desperate but competent mechanic. She didn't know Jake had grown up in a small Nebraska town where his father worked construction and his mother was a nurse, that he was the first in his family to finish high school, that he'd learned to fix cars helping his grandfather in the garage behind their house, that at 18 he'd moved to L.A. with $1,000 saved and a dream of opening his own shop. She didn't know Jake had worked like hell for 12 years, doing double shifts, studying manuals at night, becoming the best mechanic at the shop, that he'd almost reached his dream, almost had enough money saved, when everything collapsed. She didn't know Jake had a girlfriend who left him 3 months after he lost his job, telling him she couldn't wait for a man with no future. She didn't know Jake spent nights awake wondering when he'd become invisible, when his value as a person became equal to his bank account balance. But tomorrow they'd meet again, and neither was ready for what was about to happen. Jake showed up at Sterling Automotive at 8 in the morning. The building was all glass and steel, a modern monolith reflecting the Los Angeles sky. The lobby was bigger than his apartment, with marble floors and a receptionist who looked at him as if he'd tracked mud on her immaculate heels. He said he had an appointment with Ms. Sterling. The receptionist raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, checked the computer, then with evident surprise made a call. 2 minutes later, a man in a suit arrived who introduced himself as David, Victoria's personal assistant. He escorted him to the top floor in a silent elevator where you could only hear the hum of ascending numbers. Victoria's office occupied the entire floor. Glass walls offered a breathtaking view of LA, the Hollywood sign visible in the distance. Victoria was at her desk, focused on documents probably worth more than a small nation's GDP. When Jake entered, she looked up. Today there were no sunglasses hiding her eyes, and Jake saw for the first time they were green, piercing, and contained a weariness no makeup could hide. Victoria told him to sit. Then she did something that completely threw him off. She said she'd done research on him. She discovered about the shop that closed, the unpaid debts that weren't his fault, the excellent recommendations from old customers who still sought him out. She'd seen his talent yesterday on the highway, and she'd made a decision. She wouldn't give him a job at her shops. She'd give him something better. She'd give him the chance to open his own shop with financial backing from Sterling Automotive as a partner. A shop specializing in luxury cars, something LA had never seen. He'd have complete operational control. She'd provide initial funding and client contacts. Jake looked at her as if she'd spoken to him in an alien language. He asked why. Why would a woman who could have any mechanic, any business partner, bet on a desperate guy she'd met by chance on the road? Victoria stood, approached the window.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
She said she was tired of being surrounded by people who only told her what she wanted to hear, that in a world of opportunists and yes-men, she'd met someone who asked her for work, not money, someone who'd fixed her Ferrari with the care of someone who loves what they do, not someone trying to impress, and above all, someone who'd looked her in the eyes on the road as if she were a person, not a wallet. She said she needed people like that in her company. And if he accepted, he'd only have to prove her trust wasn't misplaced. Jake looked at this woman offering him his dream on a silver platter. He could have said yes immediately. Instead, he asked what the catch was. There had to be a catch. Victoria smiled for the first time, a smile that transformed her face from beautiful to extraordinary. She said the only catch was that she expected excellence. And if he failed, he'd lose everything. Jake extended his hand. She shook it. The deal was done. The following months were the most intense of Jake's life. Victoria kept her word with an efficiency that left him breathless. In 3 weeks, she'd found a perfect location in the Arts District, an old industrial warehouse transformed into a state-of-the-art shop. Equipment Jake had only dreamed of. A team of 6 mechanics chosen personally by him. Contracts with luxury car parts suppliers. But what surprised Jake more than the financial investment was Victoria's personal involvement. She came to the shop at least once a week, not to supervise but to learn. She'd take off her heels and put on work boots, listen to Jake explain projects, take notes. She didn't pretend to understand when she didn't, asked intelligent questions, suggested ideas from a business perspective Jake would never have considered. There was a mutual respect growing between them, something beyond a simple business relationship. Jake discovered Victoria had a sharp sense of humor hidden under her professional veneer. She discovered Jake had a passion for his work that bordered on art. that he talked about engines with a tenderness some men didn't even reserve for their wives. 3 months after opening, Morrison Motors was the most requested shop in LA for luxury cars. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, wealthy clients who'd heard about the young mechanic who treated every car as if it were his own. Profits exceeded the most optimistic projections, but it was during a cold November evening that something changed, definitively. Jake was closing the shop when he saw Victoria's Tesla park outside. She got out without her usual impeccable suit, wearing jeans and a sweater, hair loose on her shoulders. She looked tired, more tired than Jake had ever seen her. They sat in Jake's office. She refused the coffee he offered. Then she started talking. She talked about the board meeting that day, where 3 members had proposed a vote of no confidence against her. She talked about the constant pressure, impossible expectations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people waiting for her to fall. She talked about how sometimes she felt like a fraud, like she was just playing the part of CEO without really knowing what she was doing. Jake listened without interrupting. When she finished, with tears threatening to ruin her perfect makeup, he said something she didn't expect. He said he understood. That every day he woke up fearing he wasn't good enough, disappointing the people who'd bet on him, discovering all this was just luck destined to end. He told her that fear of failure didn't mean you were failing. It meant you cared enough to worry. And in his opinion, anyone making a motion of no confidence against her was an idiot who couldn't see how extraordinary she was. Victoria looked at him, and in that moment something broke. Or maybe something fixed itself. She moved closer and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope in equal parts. Jake responded, hands in her hair, heart beating so hard it hurt. When they separated, both knew they'd crossed a line that couldn't be ignored anymore. The following months were complicated in ways neither Jake nor Victoria had anticipated. Their relationship was a secret they guarded jealously, aware of how it would look to the outside world. The wealthy heiress and the mechanic she'd saved from the street would be reduced to a cliché, a tabloid scandal, ammunition for those wanting to damage Victoria. They saw each other in stolen moments. Late dinners at her penthouse, when she knew no one would look for her. Weekends at a beach house in Malibu that belonged to her family, but no one used anymore. Moments at the shop after everyone went home, where she learned to use tools and he taught her the difference between love for work and working for love. But the more they knew each other, the more something deeper than simple attraction grew. Jake discovered Victoria dreamed of leaving everything and traveling the world, that her favorite song was an old country ballad her mother sang to her, that she cried during sad movies even though she tried to hide it. Victoria discovered Jake read poetry at night, that he sent half his profits to his parents in Nebraska, that he wanted to someday teach the trade to kids who came from where he came from. But secrets have a cost. Victoria's extended family started asking questions about why she spent so much time at Morrison Motors. Tabloids photographed her Tesla parked outside the shop too often. Rumors started circulating. It was Victoria's cousin, Marcus, board member and ambitious to take her place, who discovered the truth. He hired a private investigator who documented everything. The dinners, the weekends, the stolen kisses. He presented the evidence to the board with a satisfied smirk, declaring Victoria had a conflict of interest, that she was using company funds to finance her boyfriend, that she was unfit to lead Sterling Automotive. The board meeting was brutal. Victoria defended every business decision she'd made regarding Morrison Motors, showing numbers that didn't lie. The investment had generated enormous profits, brought prestige to the company, opened new market opportunities. But Marcus wasn't talking about numbers. He talked about reputation, how it looked, how she'd compromised the company's integrity. Victoria left that meeting knowing she had to make a choice, her love for Jake or the company she'd sacrificed everything for. That evening she went to the shop. Jake understood as soon as he saw her. He read the decision on her face before she opened her mouth. When she said they had to end it, that the relationship was damaging too much, that she couldn't afford to lose the company, he didn't protest. He only said he understood, and that whatever happened, he'd never regret a single moment with her. Victoria cried all the way home, and for the first time in her life wondered if winning was really worth losing everything. 2 months passed, like an endless winter. Victoria threw herself into work ferociously, working 20-hour days, closing million-dollar deals, proving to everyone she was worthy of her position. She won every battle but felt hollow. Dinners at exclusive events were tasteless, conversations with business partners were empty, and every night she returned to her penthouse that felt like a luxury mausoleum. Jake continued managing Morrison Motors with the same dedication. The shop thrived. He'd opened a second location, become a respected name in the industry. But there was a shadow in his eyes that wouldn't leave, a missing joy in his work that had been so evident before. It was during a cold February evening that everything changed again. Victoria was driving home after yet another meeting when she received a call from her mother, a woman she saw once a year for obligatory Christmas lunch. Her mother told her something that made her pull over. She said she resembled her father too much, her father who'd built an empire but died alone and unsatisfied, who had all the money in the world but no one to share it with, who on his deathbed had cried saying he'd give it all away for 5 more minutes with the people he loved. Her mother asked her if it was really worth it. All that power, all that success, if it meant ending up alone. Victoria drove all night. At dawn she found herself in front of Jake's shop. Through the windows she saw him working on an engine, hands moving with that assured grace that had fascinated her the first time. When she walked in, he looked up and time stopped. She said she'd been wrong, that she'd spent 2 months winning battles that didn't matter, impressing people she didn't like, living a life she didn't want. She said the board could go to hell. Her cousin could take the company if he wanted it so badly, because she'd just figured out what it really meant to have value. Jake put down his tools and approached. He asked if she was sure, if she could really leave everything. Victoria smiled, that smile that transformed her face, and said she wasn't leaving everything. She was choosing everything that really mattered. The next day, Victoria called a press conference. She announced her resignation as CEO of Sterling Automotive, but not before restructuring the company so employees had more decision-making power and Marcus couldn't destroy it. Then she announced her new project, a foundation that would help talented young entrepreneurs without means realize their dreams. The first investment? A training program for mechanics in collaboration with Morrison Motors. Tabloids went crazy for weeks. The heiress who left everything for love. But Victoria and Jake no longer cared what people said. They'd found something rarer than success or wealth. They'd found someone with whom to build a life truly worth living. A year later, they married in a small ceremony in Nebraska, in Jake's hometown. There were no limousines or $1,000 champagne. There was Jake's family who cooked for days, real friends who loved them for who they were, and the awareness that sometimes the best love stories start with a desperate question on a dusty road. Morrison Motors became an empire in itself, not for profits, but for impact. Victoria and Jake opened training schools across America, giving hundreds of young people the same chance he'd received. And every time someone asked Victoria if she regretted leaving Sterling Automotive, she'd look at Jake covered in grease, teaching a kid how to fix an engine, and smile. She regretted nothing. Because she'd learned that true success isn't measured in dollars or power, but in moments that make you wake up happy and fall asleep grateful, and that sometimes all you need is the courage to ask the right question to the right person at the right time. Even if that question is, if I fix your Ferrari, will you give me a job? If this story made you believe that true value isn't measured in money, but in courage, leave a little heart down below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this that talk about real people with real dreams in a world that often forgets what truly matters, You can leave a little much appreciated through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts. Just like Jake's question that day on the highway that changed everything, because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.